Aperture. No one knows what it means, but it's provocative. It gets the people going. That's not true. Aperture means an opening or an open space, right? And where exactly is this open space we're talking about? It's inside the lens. When we talk about aperture, we're talking about the f-stop, and it's usually what you'll see on your camera as f2, f4.5, f5.6, f8, f11, typically up to like f22, right? And so what that number means is it's the focal length of your lens divided by the diameter of the opening inside. And that's a little complicated to say, but just know that it's a fraction. And instead of adding two fractions you're looking at, they changed one to just the number that is related to the size of the opening inside. So what does that tell us? Well, again, everything relates to light in some part of the exposure in your image, right? So when we talk about aperture, we're talking about the size of the opening. And let's think about like the door to your room or the window in your room. When the blinds are closed, right, and there's not a whole lot of light coming through, it's dark. When you open the blinds and there's more room for light to pass through, it gets brighter. So aperture size, when we think about it, is very simply put, the smaller the opening, the darker the image, the larger the opening, the brighter the image. The part that gets tricky is remembering that when you look at the f-stop number, the smaller number is actually a bigger opening, and the bigger number is actually a smaller opening. Because again, it's a fraction, it's 1 over that number is the actual relationship to the size of the opening. So let's take a closer look at what that actually looks like. I've got two here to show you a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's take a look. I've got two lenses here. One of these is a 35 millimeter lens that's widest opening is 0.95, or its widest aperture is 0.95. And then I have another lens that is a 50 millimeter, which is aperture also opens up to 0.95. And this is not common or standard, but these ones are available in non-electronic lenses, right? So there's no autofocus in these lenses. So we take a look here, and this is already set to 16, which is the wide or smallest aperture that this lens goes to. And we see right now, there's not a very big opening for the light to pass through. Now we open the aperture up, and it gets significantly bigger as we go all the way to 0.95, right? So this is as big of an opening as we can get on this lens. And then on our other lens, we do the same thing. We take the backspace off, and we're starting at 16. So as small as we can get this lens to be. And again, it's pretty small. And then we open it up, and we get significantly more room for light to pass through. So as you open the aperture or decrease the number, you're increasing the space inside. As you make the number that you read smaller, right, you are closing off the space inside, reducing the amount of light that is able to come in to the lens. And now remember, these numbers are relative to that specific lens. So let's take a look at this again. The 16 on this 50 millimeter, the opening is not quite the same size as the same opening on the 13 millimeter or on the 35 millimeter, right? We see that this opening, because it's a bigger lens, is actually still larger than the opening on the 35 millimeter lens. So what that means again is that these are fractions and they are relative in size to the lens you're using. So the other thing that aperture controls is it controls the depth of field. When we talk about depth of field, we're talking about the subject that we're pointing the camera at. That's the thing we're putting in focus. And then everything in front of it and behind it that are still in focus, where you have clarity in the details and you can see the finer points. Everything past that is now out of our depth of field. So to show you examples of this, we're going to go actually take it on the move and go set up in downtown Marietta for some shots real fast. But to talk you through it before we go out and do it, when we look at it, a large opening, right, our very large 0.95 opening has a very, very narrow depth of field, right? Whereas our 0.6 or our 16 has a very long depth of field comparatively. So when you're reading your f-stop, the larger the number, right, which means the smaller the opening, the greater the depth of field. The smaller the number, or the larger the opening, the narrower or shallower the depth of field. That's the gist of the number. Let's go take a look at what it looks like in action. All right, so for this next part, I've set this camera right here, this Canon R6 Mark II, to aperture priority. So what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to control the aperture, and the camera will auto adjust everything else. Well, mostly the shutter speed. I can still change other settings, but it will adjust the shutter speed so that I can take the picture with whatever aperture that I want set. So right now, with the aperture set at 1.8, the camera is at 2500 ISO, which I'll explain that later, and 1/100th of a second, right? So it's focused on the stool, or the skull and a flower crown. So we're going to take this photo real fast. And now what's going to happen is I'm going to adjust it, let me say it over here, so that our ISO, or that our aperture size, is now way, way, way lower to f22. And now our new exposure time is 1.3 seconds, right? So to get the same exposure of the image with our aperture significantly smaller, we have way less information, or we have way less light coming to the lens, we now have to have a significantly longer exposure time. So now when we look at these pictures side by side, we see in our first ones with a significantly shallower depth of field, we have a lot of blurring of the background of the building behind us and the streetlights. We go to our f22, which is our significantly longer depth of field, and we start to get the ridges right there in the siding of the building. We get some more clarity in that first light post and then the fence railing behind it. So we've increased our depth of field by making our aperture smaller or making the number larger. In summary, the f-stop is a relationship between the length of the lens and the size of the opening inside of it, where f is equal to a fraction that is the ratio between those two. The smaller the number, the larger the opening, the shorter the depth of field. The larger the number, the smaller the opening, the longer the depth of field. Like shutter speed and ISO, what settings you use and when you use them will give you different results. I hope this video has helped you understand aperture a little bit better and will put you in the right steps towards creating the images you intend to create. Remember, respect your gear, your spot, your subject, and most importantly, yourself. Love you guys. Take care.